Have you ever felt invisible? Like your years of wisdom no longer matter in a world moving too fast to notice? For many of us over 55, it's not age that weighs heavy, it's being underestimated. In today's story, an old man walks into a hospital, and what happens next will challenge everything you think about power, respect, and presence. If you've ever been overlooked despite all you've done, this one's for you. Watch to the end, you won't forget it. Comment with a moment you were underestimated. Like and subscribe for more true, powerful stories like this. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet, like most in the neighborhood, the kind of morning when the world moves slowly and nothing remarkable seems to happen. A soft breeze passed through the trees lining the hospital parking lot, rustling leaves already beginning to turn the color of fall. Chuck Norris, 83 years old, parked his old Ford pickup at the far end of the lot. The truck had seen better days. The paint had faded, the door creaked when opened, and the seatbelt clicked with a stubborn pause. He stepped out slowly, adjusting his cap, a fabric one with a worn patch that read Rescue 72. He stood still for a moment, looking at the hospital, clean glass windows, a polished entrance, young professionals walking in and out with coffee cups, name tags, and phones glued to their ears. Chuck reached into the back of his truck and took out a small leather folder. Inside were his medical records, handwritten notes, and a neatly folded appointment slip. He walked to the entrance at his own pace, no rush. No one noticed him. He stepped inside, where the scent of antiseptic met the sound of tapping keyboards and intercom announcements. The receptionist barely looked up. She was young, sharp-dressed, her nails tapping against the counter like a rhythm she played all day. He greeted her with a simple nod. She responded with a mechanical smile and asked, "Do you have an appointment, sir?" Chuck handed her the paper. The corners were slightly curled. Handwritten date, time, signature from Dr. Melrose, someone he hadn't met yet. She held it gingerly, looked at it, then at him, and said, "This is a very old slip. Did you confirm by phone?" Chuck answered, "I was told to come in person." She gave a look that said more than words, the kind of look older folks have grown used to. She pointed him toward the waiting area and told him to sit tight. The doctor was running behind. Chuck took a seat near the window. The chairs were too low for comfort. His knees cracked as he lowered himself, but he said nothing. He placed the folder on his lap and folded his hands. He sat quietly, observing, breathing. Minutes turned to hours. One by one, other patients came and went, young people with sprained wrists, a middle-aged couple was asking about cholesterol results. A teenager with a nosebleed was rushed in immediately. No one called his name. Across the lobby, a pair of interns chatted about a new procedure being implemented in the ER. A nurse walked past him 3 times, each time glancing but never speaking. He wasn't invisible, but he may as well have been. An elderly woman sitting beside him leaned over and asked gently, "Are you here alone?" He nodded. Her eyes softened, then returned to her magazine. Chuck didn't complain, he never did. Complaining, he believed, changed nothing. He watched people instead. I observed how they walked, how they looked at their phones, and how quickly they spoke. This world moved too fast, and yet it never really looked. His appointment had been for 10:15. It was now past noon. He got up once to ask the front desk, and the receptionist responded with a brisk, "Someone will be with you shortly." She didn't look up. Chuck returned to his seat. By 1 p.m., most of the morning patients had gone. The lobby emptied a little. A young orderly named Damon leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. Another nurse walked past and muttered under her breath, "Someone should tell that old man his appointment probably got cancelled." Chuck heard it. He didn't flinch. What they didn't know was that 30 years ago, in a medical tent in Kandahar, Chuck had saved the life of a young soldier bleeding out from a chest wound. What they didn't know was that 20 years ago, Chuck had trained first responders on emergency trauma protocols now used in hospitals like this, and what they really didn't know was that he had helped design the rapid code system that this very hospital used in its trauma wing. None of that was visible now, not in his jacket, not in the faded jeans, not in the way he sat. But it was still there, in the way he watched, the way he waited, in the way he breathed. He didn't come to be honored. He came for a routine heart check, nothing urgent, just another appointment. But what he walked into was something very few of us talk about. The quiet, steady erosion of dignity when age masks experience. When people stop asking who you are and start assuming they already know. Outside, the clouds were gathering. A light drizzle began. Chuck didn't move. He wasn't bothered. He'd been through deserts, storms, and worse. A delay didn't shake him. But it was telling me this wasn't just about waiting. It was about what that waiter said. He watched a janitor sweep the floor carefully. The man looked older than most staff. He nodded at Chuck as he passed. Chuck nodded back. That small gesture, respectful and human, felt like the only acknowledgement he'd received all morning. Then the intercom buzzed. Code yellow, pediatric emergency. A young girl, 9 years old, was being wheeled in, pale, motionless. The hallway buzzed with movement. Doctors rushed. Nurses shouted instructions. Equipment carts rattled as they were pushed down the corridor. Chuck stood, his eyes narrowed, not in alarm, in focus. He saw something others didn't. He saw the child's skin tone, the chest movement, or lack thereof, the rhythm of the staff, disjointed, slightly off. He stepped forward, 1 step, then 2. He stopped just outside the ER door. He wasn't here to interfere. But instincts built over decades of field work told him something wasn't going right. A doctor in his early 30s led the team, confident but rushed. His voice cracked under pressure. "Push 1 dose of epinephrine. Continue compressions." The monitor blinked. No pulse. Chuck took 1 more step. He wasn't supposed to be there, but something in his posture made even the head nurse pause. And that's when he said it. 5 quiet words. "She needs glucose, not adrenaline." Everything froze. The doctor turned sharply. "Who are you?" Chuck took 1 more step and calmly said, "You're missing hypoglycemia. Check her blood sugar now. If you give her another shot of adrenaline, her heart might not come back." The nurse beside him blinked, uncertain. Then another voice spoke from the corner. It was the janitor who had followed behind and now stood still, watching. "His name's Chuck Norris," the janitor said softly. "He taught my cousin everything she knows about field trauma. He saved people when we didn't even have proper ambulances. If he says check blood sugar, you check it." A silence filled the room, heavy but not hostile. The doctor looked at Chuck. Something in his expression shifted. He gave a slight nod. "Check glucose," the doctor said. Seconds later, the monitor beeped. "Blood sugar, dangerously low." Chuck spoke again, quietly but firmly. "Tilt her left. Reduce compression pressure. Her lungs need more space." They followed his instructions. The room held its breath. The child coughed, then again, and just like that, a breath returned to a life thought gone. Chuck stepped back from the ER doorway, just enough to let the doctors and nurses take over. He didn't stay to watch. He didn't need to. The girl was breathing again. Her mother cried from down the hall, saying everything. He walked slowly back toward the lobby. No one stopped him. People made space without realizing they were doing it. Some watched him go, others whispered. A few simply stood in silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The janitor followed a few steps behind, keeping his distance. Chuck paused near the water cooler, filled a paper cup and took a long sip. His hands were steady, His mind was still calm. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't explain. He didn't offer credentials or ask to be thanked. He simply walked to his seat, sat down, and rested his palms on his knees. That was when the receptionist finally noticed him again. She stood, then hesitated. Her eyes were unsure, darting between her monitor and the man who had quietly stepped in and saved a child's life. She took a breath, stood straighter, and walked over to him. She asked softly if he'd like to be seen now. Chuck nodded once. Her voice shook slightly as she said she would get someone immediately. 10 minutes later, a man in a white coat approached. Early 50s, sharp suit under the lab coat, confident gait. But his face changed the moment he saw Chuck. His eyes widened. Then something softer settled behind them. Recognition. He extended a hand and said, "It's an honor to meet you in person." Chuck stood slowly and accepted the handshake with a firm grip. The doctor introduced himself as Michael Grant, head of internal medicine. He didn't mention titles, awards, or rank. Instead, he said, "I read your field notes in med school. You trained half the people who trained me." They walked into an exam room together. Grant asked a few basic questions, checked vitals, and reviewed the appointment notes. Then he paused. He looked at Chuck carefully and said, "You didn't come here for attention. You didn't correct anyone. Why?" Chuck smiled faintly. His answer was quiet. "I came for a checkup, not a lecture, and besides, sometimes people need to trip over their own assumptions before they can stand on new ground." Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "I wish more people understood that." As they wrapped up the visit, Grant stood and placed a hand lightly on Chuck's shoulder. "If you ever want to teach again, we could use someone like you." Chuck chuckled, said maybe, but his eyes said he already had. Back in the lobby, word had spread. The young nurse who had ignored him earlier now avoided his gaze. The orderly stood straighter. The receptionist offered to schedule his follow-up personally. But Chuck didn't stay long. He thanked them politely, returned to his truck, and drove off without hurry. No one noticed the small detail as he pulled away. The same janitor stood near the entrance, saluting quietly. Later that afternoon, the hospital staff gathered for a routine meeting, but the tone had shifted. People talked about what had happened, not just the emergency, but the man in the lobby. Some admitted they'd brushed past him without thinking. Others confessed they'd assumed he was confused, maybe even senile. The doctor who led the girls' emergency care stood up. He was young, bright, and shaken. He told the room what Chuck had done. He described the 5 instructions. And then he asked a simple question. How many other people have we ignored because we thought they had nothing left to teach? Silence followed. The janitor raised his hand and said something no one forgot. "That man once taught my cousin how to stabilize a wounded soldier in under 3 minutes. My cousin used that technique in Iraq, saved 6 lives. I don't know much about medicine, but I know when someone's presence changes a room." The meeting ended differently that day. There was no formal training announced, no mandatory memo, just a ripple of awareness that moved through the halls. A quiet change in posture, in tone, in how people say good morning. Chuck, meanwhile, returned to his home on the edge of town, a modest house with a long porch, wind chimes by the doorway. He changed out of his hospital clothes, put on his old flannel shirt, and sat in the backyard with a cup of tea. He watched the sun begin to dip behind the hills. The birds grew quieter. The cows farther down the field shifted lazily. It was peaceful. He thought about the little girl. He didn't know her name. Didn't need to. He only hoped she'd be okay, not just now, but years from now. When the world would ask her to be quick, clever, and loud, he hoped she'd remember that, sometimes, the wisest people say the least. That evening, a knock came at the door. Chuck stood, walked over, and opened it slowly. It was Dr. Grant. Not in a white coat, just a man in jeans carrying a book. "I didn't want to intrude," he said, "but I figured you might want this back." It was one of Chuck's old manuals, printed years ago, covered in notes and corrections. Chuck looked at it for a moment, then laughed gently. "I didn't think anyone still read that." Grant smiled. "I think more people should." They sat on the porch for a while. No rush, no need to fill the silence. Just two men, decades apart in age, sharing space without trying to impress one another. Grant eventually asked, "How did you know?" "About the girl." Chuck took a slow breath. "I didn't know. I just watched. When people panic, they look for patterns. But patterns can lie, the body does. And the 5 things you said? They weren't from a book, they were from memory, experience, lessons learned in tents, on dirt floors, with no machines. When it's just your hands, your eyes, and your faith." Grant nodded slowly. "That's what we're missing, isn't it?" Chuck looked out toward the trees. Maybe not missing, maybe just buried under too much noise. They talked a little longer, about medicine, about life, about how quiet people often carry the loudest stories. When Grant left, he didn't offer a handshake. He simply placed the manual down beside Chuck and said, "Thank you." Chuck sat there long after the sun had gone. The sky turned dark, stars peeked out. Somewhere down the road a barn owl called. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. In the stillness he remembered something from years ago. A young medic, trembling in the desert, asked him what to do when nothing made sense. Chuck had told him to start with what's still working. Listen, then move. And maybe, in a world spinning faster than ever, that advice still holds true. He finished his tea, stood slowly, and stepped back inside. The porch light flickered on behind him, the door closed, but the presence remained, the quiet, steady kind that doesn't fade. Chuck Norris didn't save the day because he needed to be a hero. He saved it because he never stopped watching, never stopped caring, and never forgot what it means to serve, even when no one's watching. So he reminded a whole building full of people of what dignity truly looks like. Chuck didn't tell anyone what had happened that day at the hospital. He didn't call friends or post a story. He didn't even mention it during his weekly grocery run, where the cashier always asked how his day was. To him, the moment had passed. It had done what it needed to do, no more, no less. But stories like that don't stay hidden for long, especially when people who witnessed it can't quite shake the feeling that they saw something important, something rare. Word began to spread, not like gossip, but like quiet respect. Staff whispered about the old man who spoke 5 sentences and turned an emergency around. Within a week, someone at the hospital filed a report, not to criticize or complain, but to ask a simple question. Who was that man? The response came slowly, through layers of staff who didn't know, didn't ask, or had only caught a glimpse, but eventually the name surfaced. Chuck Norris, not the actor, not the fighter, just a man who once served, once taught, and still watched the world with the eyes of someone who had seen it all, and never stopped learning. A young nurse named Emily took it further. She stayed late one evening, digging into archived field manuals. She found one that matched his name. It was old, scanned from paper, filled with handwritten notes. The signature at the bottom matched the visitor log from that Tuesday. She printed the first page and brought it to the weekly senior staff meeting. Most people at the table looked confused until Dr. Grant read the line aloud. Field Trauma Protocol, Emergency Triage, developed by Norris, c. 1985. Then a quiet settled over the room, as if the walls themselves remembered. The story changed shape that day. It became a lesson, not just in medical techniques, but also in awareness, in humility. What does it mean to stay present in a world that values speed over wisdom? Meanwhile, Chuck returned to his normal routine. He tended to his small garden, fixed a loose gate hinge, and cleaned the tools in his garage. He moved slowly, deliberately, not out of weakness, but with the patience of someone who no longer needed to rush. One morning he received a letter, hand-delivered, sealed in a plain white envelope. Inside was an invitation. Not flashy, not formal, just a note from Dr. Grant, asking if he'd be willing to come back to the hospital, not as a patient, but as a guest, to speak, to share what he knew. Chuck read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it on the kitchen table. He stared out the window for a while, watching birds hop between fence posts. He wasn't sure what he would say, but maybe that was the point. A week later he returned. Same pickup, same cap, same quiet steps. This time someone greeted him at the door. Not a receptionist, not an intern, but Dr. Grant himself. He shook Chuck's hand and led him through the main corridor, now lined with subtle glances and nods of recognition. They entered a modest conference room, not a full auditorium, just 20 people, nurses, young doctors, and even 2 EMTs from a nearby town. Chuck took a seat at the head of the table. No podium, no microphone. He began by saying he wasn't there to teach anyone how to be a hero. He didn't like that word. It was too easy to say, too hard to live up to. Instead, he told them stories, small ones, quiet ones, about medics in the desert who saved lives with only gauze and instinct, about the mistakes he made and what he learned, about the importance of breathing before deciding, listening before assuming, and watching what others miss. He spoke for an hour, not straight through. He paused often, let silence do its work. People leaned in, not because his voice was loud, but because it was steady, earned. Afterward, one of the EMTs asked what to do when everything feels overwhelming. Chuck answered, "Slow down. Your hands can't help if your mind is racing ahead of the moment." That sentence stayed with people. It made its way into memos, on post-it notes, into morning briefings, not because it was new, but because it was true. Back home, Chuck went on with life. He didn't change, he didn't start giving lectures, he didn't build a platform or start a blog. He chopped firewood, repaired an old hose, watched the clouds roll across the fields. But the world around him had shifted. Every now and then, someone from the hospital stopped by, sometimes just to say thank you, sometimes ask about pressure points or field improvisations, sometimes just to sit and share a cup of tea. Chuck never said no, but he never tried to lead. He simply welcomed them, let them come and go as they needed. That was how he lived. One evening, Emily, the young nurse, brought her father to visit. He was a retired firefighter in his 60s. The three of them sat on the porch, talking about long nights, hard calls, and the things you carry, even after the work is done. Chuck told them about a medic in his unit who had frozen during a rescue, not from fear, but from heartbreak. He said, "Sometimes people don't break down because they're weak, they break down because they've held too much for too long. That's not failure, that's the cost of caring deeply." Emily wiped a tear. Her father nodded. That moment, quiet and real, meant more than any seminar. Chuck didn't try to impress. He didn't need to. His presence did the work. His stillness taught more than words ever could. Later that night as they were leaving, Emily asked him one last question. If you could tell every young medic just one thing, what would it be? Chuck paused, then said, "Never walk into a room assuming you know who's worth listening to. You might miss the one voice that could save a life." They drove away slowly. Chuck stayed on the porch a while longer, watching the stars appear. His dog came and lay at his feet. The wind picked up, just enough to rattle the wind chimes. He thought about the world, about how it rushes so fast that even wisdom can get lost in the noise, and how sometimes it only takes one moment of clarity to remind people what truly matters. The next morning, Chuck woke early, like he always did. He made coffee, fed the animals, and sat with a notebook. Not to write a book or a speech, just to remember. He jotted down a few things. A name, a date, a phrase that had helped someone. He wasn't trying to build a legacy. He was just honoring memory. Across town, at the hospital, a new poster had gone up in the staff break room. It wasn't flashy, just a simple photo. A man in a flannel shirt is sitting under a tree beside an old truck. No title, just a line underneath. Respect walks quietly, listen anyway. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of a different kind of change. One that didn't need meetings or mandates, just a shift in attention, a willingness to see more than what's obvious. Chuck never asked for that photo, never posed for it, but someone had taken it from the parking lot that day, captured it without even knowing what they were seeing. And maybe that's the whole point. The most valuable lessons don't shout, they whisper, and they stay long after the moment has passed. ChatGPT said. Chuck never expected the hospital to call him again. He figured the talks, the quiet visits, and the porch conversations were more than enough. He had given what he had. Not for recognition, but because the right people had asked, with the right intentions. So when Dr. Grant reached out one crisp morning in early spring, Chuck was surprised. Not annoyed, just curious. Grant didn't ask him to come speak, he asked him to observe. There's going to be a training simulation, he said. Trauma response, pediatric case. I want you in the room, not to teach, just to be there. Chuck hesitated, then agreed. Something in Grant's tone felt different this time. Not formal, but urgent, like the hospital itself was shifting, trying to become something more grounded, more aware. That Friday, Chuck arrived early. Same pickup, same gait in his walk. He wore a simple blue jacket and carried nothing but his hands in his pockets. The room was already buzzing with voices when he stepped in. Young doctors were gathered round simulation dummies. There were clipboards, IV bags, and digital monitors. It looked technical, prepared, and rehearsed. Chuck stood quietly at the edge, unnoticed for a while. He liked it that way. He watched the first scenario unfold. A boy, aged 10, was simulated as unresponsive after a bike accident. The team worked fast. One took vitals, another checked breathing, one gave instructions with clipped efficiency. It was textbook. Quick, accurate. But something in their rhythm felt too tight, too focused on the task, not on presence. Chuck didn't interrupt. He simply stepped closer. Grant noticed and walked over. He asked Chuck quietly what he saw. Chuck replied, "They're fast, but they're not listening to the body. They're following protocol but missing presence. You can't treat a patient like a checklist." That sentence echoed louder than Chuck intended. A few heads turned. One of the nurses, fresh out of school, looked down at her notes. Grant nodded, then called for a break. During the break, Chuck sat with 3 trainees. They asked small questions at first, then more honest ones. What do you do when you freeze? How do you stay calm when a child stops breathing? Chuck answered slowly, not with advice, but with stories. He told them about a night in a jungle village. No power, no medicine, only the sound of rain and a child slipping away. He told them how fear doesn't disappear, it just gets quieter when you know what to do with your hands. He told them that stillness isn't weakness, it's focus. The room changed after that. Later, as the next round of simulations began, one young doctor asked Chuck to stand beside her. Just for presence, not to guide. She said his calmness helped her breathe better. Chuck stood beside her without saying a word. She handled the scenario differently, slower, more aware. She looked at the dummy like a person, not a problem. She remembered to speak softly, to touch gently. The result wasn't just technical success, it was human. When the exercise ended, the lead instructor walked over. He said Chuck had changed the temperature of the room, that no written manual could have done what his presence had just done. Chuck smiled. He didn't need credit. He just wanted the kids to make it home. A week later, the hospital announced a new program. It is not just technical training, but what they call depth training. Presence under pressure, listening through chaos. Chuck didn't design it, but his fingerprints were all over it. Dr. Grant invited Chuck to a round table. No suits, just people. Nurses, EMTs, administrators, and even 2 social workers. The goal was simple: to ask what gets lost when we move too fast. Chuck listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he said, "When the heart gets rushed, the hands forget how to care." That sentence became the program's motto. It showed up on posters, in newsletters, in the break room above the sink. Chuck didn't care for mottos, but he liked that people were paying attention. Outside the hospital, word began to spread further. A firefighter captain called Chuck to ask if he'd speak to their new recruits. A retired Navy medic wrote him a letter, thanking him for restoring dignity to a role often forgotten. Chuck kept it all quiet. He didn't want a spotlight. He still mowed his lawn, still fed his dog before 8, still sat on the porch most evenings, watching the wind move the trees. One morning, as he raked leaves behind the shed, a woman arrived in a navy coat. She was the mother of the girl Chuck had helped during the original ER emergency. She didn't come with a gift, just a photo. It was her daughter, now smiling, standing in front of a small bike. Back on her feet, breathing easy. The woman said they'd been meaning to find him. She said no doctor had explained things the way Chuck had in those 5 words. He didn't say much, just took the photo gently, held it a moment, then nodded. The mother didn't stay long. She didn't have to. Some thank yous don't need a ceremony, just eye contact and quiet understanding. That photo found its way to the shelf inside Chuck's kitchen, between an old compass and a folded American flag, not displayed like a trophy, just resting, like part of the home. Weeks passed, then months. The hospital training program grew. Staff reported fewer rushed mistakes, more moments of shared breath before action, more kindness in the middle of chaos. And people began to talk about presence, about how the way you walk into a room can change the way care happens, not just with patients, with each other. Chuck never claimed credit. When asked about it, he said, "I just showed up. That's all. That's what we're all trying to do." One afternoon, he sat under the tree in his backyard. It was late. The sun filtered through like gold. His dog napped beside him. A student from the hospital came by. She was finishing her rotation. She asked if she could record him saying a few words for their training library. Chuck hesitated, then said yes. She set her phone on the table, asked what he'd like new medics to hear. He paused, then said, "Remember that people aren't problems. They're scared, tired, and confused. They need steady hands, soft voices, clear eyes. Learn the steps, but don't forget to see the person. And never let fear make you faster than you need to be." The recording was short, just 2 minutes, but it went viral within the hospital system. They played it during orientation, during night shifts, when morale ran low. Chuck didn't know. He didn't ask. He was in his shed, tuning up a lawnmower, listening to the radio, humming low. Because that's how he lived. Quietly, purposefully, with a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, but is felt deeply when needed most. ChatGPT said, Chuck didn't think much of legacy, not the way people often speak of it. To him, legacy wasn't something you left behind. It was something you passed forward, piece by piece, in the way you showed up, listened, and stayed present when it mattered most. But sometimes legacy catches up to you. One cool evening in late fall, a black SUV pulled into Chuck's driveway. It wasn't rushed, just deliberate. A woman stepped out, dressed neatly in a dark coat, carrying a small folder. She introduced herself simply. Her name was Ellen, and she was from the State Board of Medical Education. Chuck raised an eyebrow, but welcomed her in with a warm gesture toward the porch. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she looked at the landscape, the sky, and the quiet rhythm of the place. Then she turned to him and said something he hadn't expected. "Your name has come up in several training reviews across multiple counties, not for criticism, for impact." She told him they'd seen a measurable drop in emergency room escalation cases, a rise in patient satisfaction among elderly patients, even a decline in reported staff burnout. And in every meeting, in every memo, his name appeared. Not in big letters, just quietly there, like a shadow of trust. She opened the folder and handed him a letter. It was an invitation. A statewide conference on medical resilience and patient presence, not for doctors only, for anyone whose work touched lives in crisis. They wanted him to speak. Chuck read it carefully. He didn't answer right away. Ellen said, "We're not asking for a keynote or a lecture, just your presence. The way you carry silence has done more for some of our people than months of training." Chuck looked out toward the horizon. The trees were golden now, almost ready to lose their leaves. He nodded once. "All right," he said, "I'll go. But I won't wear a suit." A month later, Chuck arrived at the conference. Not in the pickup this time. A nurse named Jason had driven him. He wore a soft blazer, still paired with his usual work boots. No name tag, no slides, no script. The auditorium was filled with people. Some were young, some grey-hailed, some sat with folded arms, skeptical. Others leaned forward, already open. Chuck was introduced simply, not with a list of titles, just as a man whose quiet example had changed how many of them now approach care. He walked up slowly, stood in front of the microphone but didn't speak into it. He looked at the room for a while, let it settle. Then he said, "You won't remember everything I say, so I won't say much, but if there's one thing worth carrying with you, it's this. People remember how you showed up, long after they forget what you did." He told them about the girl in the hospital, about the 5 things he said, and more importantly about the dozens of things he didn't say, but noticed how her shoes were still new, how her mother never blinked, how the intern's hands trembled just enough to know he cared. He told them that medicine is not just science, it's memory, memory of what it means to be human. After his talk, no one clapped loudly, no one cheered, they just stood, not as an ovation but as an offering, quiet thanks. Backstage, a man waited. He looked familiar. He had short cropped hair and eyes that scanned a room without needing to move. He introduced himself as Colonel Daniel Reese, a retired combat medic who is now an advisor to national training protocols. He told Chuck something simple. "We've been watching what you've done and we'd like your help." Chuck raised an eyebrow again. Reese continued, "We want to build something lasting, a model not just for technique, but for presence. We'd like you to help write it." Chuck replied softly, "I'm not a writer." Reese smiled. "Neither am I. That's why we ask those who've lived it." And so it began. Not with blueprints or meetings, but with conversations. Chuck agreed to meet monthly, not in offices, but at his home around a table with coffee and notebooks and questions. Young medics came, veterans came, nurses who'd lost patients, paramedics who'd saved them. They talked about the moments that changed them. Not the dramatic ones, the quiet ones. The ones where they stayed in a room an extra 5 minutes because something in them said, "Don't go yet." Chuck listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was never about himself. It was about attention, about reading the room, about learning how to be with people when they are most afraid, most angry, most alone. Over time, these meetings turned into a document, not a manual, a guide, called simply Presence Under Pressure. Hospitals began requesting copies, firehouses pinned quotes from it on lockers, police academies were asked to adapt the material, a school counselor in Arizona emailed Chuck to say she'd been using it, with students experiencing grief. Chuck read the email 3 times, then set it aside, smiling faintly. One day, Dr. Grant visited again, this time not for planning or updates, he just wanted to check in. They sat on the porch. The sky was pale blue. The wind carried a cool promise of winter. Grant asked Chuck if he ever thought about what he'd built. Chuck shrugged. "I didn't build anything, I just didn't leave." Grant nodded, understanding more than the words. Then he told Chuck something he'd been meaning to say. "We've renamed one of the simulation rooms at the hospital. It's now the Norris room. Not for the movies, for the man who taught us how to stay human." Chuck didn't reply at first, just looked out at the field. Then said, "If you ever forget what matters, just go sit in that room. Not to remember me, to remember why you chose this work in the first place." The wind picked up, the sun slid lower, and in that silence something settled. Not pride, just peace. Chuck wasn't done, but he had already given enough. The world kept spinning, the hospital kept healing, and one man who never asked to be seen became someone no one could forget. Winter came slowly that year, the kind of winter where the cold didn't rush in, but crept gently, touching the edges of every window, every field, every quiet road. Chuck noticed it was not in the temperature, but in the way the trees stopped moving. The air got still. The mornings felt quieter than usual. He adjusted his routine, started his days later, sat longer on the porch with his coffee. The dog stayed curled at his feet longer, sensing the change. Some days he didn't do much at all, just listened, let the wind speak. The requests hadn't stopped. More hospitals wanted him to visit, more schools asked for recordings. A few companies, non-medical ones, sent letters asking if he would consult on presence and leadership. Chuck read them, smiled, and folded them into a drawer. He wasn't trying to lead anything, he wasn't chasing relevance, he had no interest in being a brand. But one letter stayed on the table longer than the others. It came from a young man named David, a social worker from a rough neighborhood 2 towns over. David had started a weekend program for kids with trauma. Nothing big, just a group in a church basement. He wrote that the kids didn't listen to lectures, they didn't trust experts. But when he played that 2-minute audio of Chuck speaking, something shifted. One boy, barely 13, asked if the man in the recording would ever come talk to them in person. Chuck stared at the letter for a long time. That weekend, he borrowed Jason's car and drove out. He didn't dress up, didn't bring notes, just walked into that basement room like it was any other porch. There were 10 kids, maybe 12, all quiet, all guarded. Chuck didn't introduce himself right away. He asked their names, asked what they liked to fix. Bikes, skateboards, old phones. He told them he liked fixing things too, and sometimes people. He told them about a little girl whose heart had stopped, about a team of people who panicked, about how saying just 5 simple things made all the difference. He didn't say it to impress. He said it because it was true. Then he looked each of them in the eye, slowly, one by one, and said, "People will tell you that no one listens. But if you learn to stay still long enough, they do." Something broke open in that room. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a shift, a breath. David later wrote that it was the first time in months that some of those kids had opened up. Not because Chuck had taught them something new, but because he reminded them that they already had something worth holding on to. Chuck went back the next month, and the one after. Sometimes he didn't talk at all, just sat in the corner sipping tea while the kids played cards or argued about music. Presence does not require performance. Meanwhile, back in town, something unexpected happened. The local school principal called to say they wanted to name their new leadership room after Chuck. He gently declined. Then they offered something else. Don't name a room, start a silent bell. What? The principal asked. Chuck explained. A small moment at the beginning of every day where people stop. 1 minute. No phones, no tasks. Just sit, think, breathe. Let the day catch up to you before you run into it. They tried it. Teachers thought it was odd. Kids fidgeted at first. But after 2 weeks, complaints dropped. Tensions eased. One teacher wrote anonymously that she cried quietly through her first silence bell. Not from sadness, from relief. Chuck didn't visit the school. Didn't want to. But he heard the bell when it rang on a windless morning, echoing faintly over the hill. He smiled and went back to his tool shed. By now, people had stopped asking who he was. They started asking how he did it, how he calmed a room without speaking, how brought clarity without control. Chuck never answered directly. He didn't believe in formulas. He believed in showing up. One evening, as he was closing the barn door, Jason pulled in fast. He had a look on his face that Chuck hadn't seen in a while. Urgent. Soft. He said the hospital had an emergency. Not medical. Emotional. A senior nurse had collapsed. Not from injury, from exhaustion. 20 years in the job and she just stopped. They didn't know who else to call. Chuck grabbed his coat and got in the truck. At the hospital, he didn't go to the nurse's station. He went to the break room. Sat down. Waited. Word spread that he was there. Some came in, unsure why. Some just leaned against the wall, not speaking. Finally, the nurse came in. Her face was pale. Her eyes were tired. She sat across from him and said nothing. Chuck looked at her, steady. He said, I once watched a helicopter pilot fall asleep mid-flight. He hadn't rested in 3 days. We didn't scold him. We just landed, took the controls for a while, let him sleep. The nurse broke. Not loudly. Just a breath, a drop of the shoulders. Chuck said nothing more, but he stayed. That night, a new kind of memo went out, one that didn't list protocols. It simply said, if you are carrying too much, let someone know. Not for punishment, for support. Chuck returned home late, sat under the stars with his dog, thought about how often people break, not because they are weak, but because they hold too much, for too long with no one to notice. Winter deepened. Frost stayed on the windows longer. Chuck moved more slowly, took longer naps, let the dog sleep inside. Letters still came, some he read, some he saved for later. All of them said the same thing in different ways. Thank you for reminding us how to be present, how to lead without shouting, how to heal without fixing. Chuck didn't reply to most, but he held them all. He began writing again. Not a book, not a manual, just short reflections, 1-page thoughts. He called them notes from the field. Not about medicine, about attention, about silence, about how to enter a room without disrupting it and leave it a little more whole than when you arrived. David printed some for his youth group. The hospital requested copies. A retired general wrote to say they should be taught at West Point. Chuck laughed when he read that, then made more coffee. He had never tried to leave a mark. He just didn't look away when something important passed through the room. And that, in the end, was what people remembered most. Not what he said, but how does he stay? Some stories aren't just stories, they're reminders. For anyone over 55, this tale might feel more real than fiction, because too often our years of service, sacrifice, and silent strength are overlooked in a world obsessed with speed and surface. But here's the truth. presence is not about how loud you speak, it's in how deeply you've lived. And influence isn't about titles or trending posts. It's about the impact that remains long after you've left the room. Chuck didn't need to be recognized. He didn't chase attention. He carried decades of knowledge not to boast, but to serve when it mattered most. And maybe that's the real power of age, the stillness that unsettles, the silence that teaches, and the experience that can shift outcomes with just 5 words. If you're someone still working, leading, raising others, or simply trying to stay grounded in a fast world, remember this: you don't have to prove your worth every day. Sometimes being present with quiet confidence is enough. And sometimes it's everything. Thank you for spending time reading this story. If it resonated with you, we'd love to hear a moment when your wisdom made a difference, even if no one saw it at first. Share it in the comments below. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, more moments that honor the dignity of experience, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your voice matters, your story matters, and we're here to help you remember that.